welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. As always, there's never anyone else here to start the podcast. And I am here today with a very fun episode, once again, for Women's History Month. I mean, I like it. It feels a little performative, you know, the whole thing, I'll be honest, and it is pretty white. But from a entirely personal perspective when it comes to Women's History Month, I just appreciate that it really does give me a theme to work off of, because honestly, sometimes the hardest thing about this show is just picking a topic, 7 years in. It's tough, which is why I then get to hoard episodes and ideas for months like this. So, if anything, I can be grateful for that. And that is what leads me to today's conversation. Today's conversation is with returning guest and generally lovely human and fellow podcaster and Homeric specialist. I'm really bad at academia terms. Anyway, it's Julia Perroni, who is just so lovely. Julia is the host of the podcast Classically Trained, which, because its hosts are doing PhDs and shit, it's, not necessarily as prolific as mine, but it is a wonderful podcast about reception of things featuring the classical world. So much fun. But a while back, I'll be honest, Julie and I sat down to record this episode. It had to have been in the fall, but Women's Month. And it was such a thrill of an episode. I still remember that I basically was on Twitter in the olden days, and Julia tweeted about writing a dissertation on a queer theory reading of Circe, and I literally just replied okay, so you're coming on my show to talk about this? And then here we are. So the preface is this was recorded a while back. It's obvious in things like talking about Twitter only recently becoming X. It's a whole deal, a little timely, but it was just a true joy to talk with Julia about this and to listen to all these incredible queer theory readings when it comes to Circe in Homer's Odyssey. And so that is what today's episode is all about. It is all about Circe as another, just as an alternate, someone beyond the binary, the dichotomy that, typically existed in reading these types of things from the ancient world. So I just want to clarify that is what the topic is about today. This sort of Circe beyond the confines of the old school binary. Utterly, utterly fascinating. Really, I'm just going to let you all listen to it because I just did, and I really enjoyed it. It was so much fun having Julia back. I could talk about, either Circe or the Odyssey literally forever and be perfectly happy, so this was a joy. And it was a particular joy listening back to it after so long since I recorded. Those are just fun. When you're oh right, oh my god, this was great. I'm so glad I get to finally share it with people. So, on that note, enjoy. Conversations. On Circe's Island, anything is possible. Queer Theory with Julia Perroni. So I was thinking about this. I was thinking about the, how I would open this conversation earlier, because I've done with you what I've done a couple times with other guests where, I will hear a topic and be I want to learn, I want you to come on and talk about it. And then I'll, jot it down. And then I'll promptly, not forget the topic, but, forget all the details that made me want to talk to you about it. So, in your case, I wrote down, queer Circe. And then that's all I remember. It's pretty self-explanatory, I think.
But yeah. To be fair, I think that's basically all I said in the tweet that caused you to go eyes emoji at me. So there wasn't much substance to the pitch, as it were.
Well, it doesn't take much for me. You said keywords.
Yes. Listen, that is... that's all you need.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Queer Circe.
Here for it. So yeah, I'm just excited. Tell me everything.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, and I can just kind of I read through the thesis this morning and sort of made some notes for myself of like the highlights of stuff that I felt like I could explain in a reasonable way.
Fair.
And some stuff I can go into like at great length and probably not make any sense because it's like dense queer theory stuff, but other things are like, here's a fun highlight.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, we can kind of go into anything. Like, I've definitely, like, this won't be the first episode touching on queer theory. Not that I have done that, but other people have come on and taught me about it, which is great. So yeah, like, whatever you want, honestly. But like, why don't you tell me like how you got the idea to study this concept of queer Circe, and then like the basics, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been working on queer like Homer stuff for a while, actually. When I did my first master's degree at King's College London, I wrote my master's dissertation, which is what they call it in England. They go the other way, master's dissertation, doctoral thesis, than we do here.
I didn't even know because I have a BA, and we didn't even have to do like whatever the one in the BA is for mine. So
yeah, no, yeah. So while I was in the UK, I wrote a dissertation, quote unquote, master's dissertation. And that was on Achilles. And I was dealing with a sort of queer approach to Achilles. And I have remained interested in thinking about queer approaches to Homer. So not the spring that just passed, but the spring of 2022, I took a seminar on queer and feminist theory. And, when I was fishing around for a topic, I knew that I wanted to work on something Homeric. I'd kind of already had that in my head. I did a book review on a book that was about like women in Homer, and then I was kind of thinking about Circe jumped out to me. And I think it was kind of, it was one of those like gut instinct things that I then had to go hunt for an academic justification for, which is like pretty common. I was like, okay, like there's something here that is like ringing a little queer bell in the back of my mind, and I need to dig it up. So I went thinking about how to go about that. And I wrote a paper for that class that turned into essentially the first draft of what became my second master's thesis, which I can tell you the title of, actually.
Please.
If you so desire. The title of which, a somewhat boring title, Crossing Paths, Crossing Lines, Reading Circe as Queer in the Odyssey, which I wrote and submitted this spring. And the crossing lines part of that is a reference to what I ended up choosing as the kind of the main theoretical framework of the project, which is Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, which is a great book. I highly recommend it, but it is also phenomenology, which is like very, very philosophical and kind of complicated and hard to explain, but essentially comes down to a system of ideas about how objects in the world acquire meaning through interaction. Like that a table isn't a table until it's used as a table in a repeated way.
That makes sense.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
I like that. Also, it's good. It's a good
and
word.
Like, yes, phenomenology.
Phenomenology.
The study of phenomena in the world, and how we experience things, and how by experiencing them and by interacting with them, they come to take on these meanings, and we change. Like, action creates the meaning of things in the world. So that sort of school of philosophy is where the early groundwork of Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity came from, for example. That gender is something that you do, not something that just is. So in some ways it's quite foundational to some very foundational queer theoretical stuff, but phenomenology itself is like it's like very theory-y. But Ahmed's queer phenomenology is, I think, a mercifully lucid book, and like written in a way that makes sense of the whole thing. And of course, I cannot possibly explain it very well because it is an extremely dense idea, but some of the stuff she touches on in that book, particularly the concepts, the sort of central concepts of orientation and disorientation, and relatedly ideas about comfort and feeling at home versus feeling disorientated or being disorientated due to the way that we interact with each other and the way that we encounter social expectations, which are in themselves, which sort of create objects that we interact with, and what objects in both the physical and abstract sense we are able to like connect with in the world. So, and how as a queer person, those interactions, the things that are in the objects or bodies that are in reach are different from the sort of standard, what she calls sedimented line or pattern of experience and behavior. And a lot of this is very interesting and useful for thinking about, and she does a bunch of stuff not only with sexuality but also with race and thinking about migration in later chapters in the book, which is very useful for dealing with the Odyssey, which is a story about traveling, you know, and about encountering the strange and then finding, like, working your way back towards something normal. And so my thesis really focuses on Circe and what Circe is embedded in, which is what are sometimes called like the journey books or the story books or whatever, like where when Odysseus is narrating the tales of his many adventures to the Phaeacians, books 8 through 12, I think,
the
roughly
good
9
ones.
through 12. Yes, the ones that everybody like knows all the stories from.
Yeah, this is the best parts of the Odyssey, let's be honest.
Totally. When most people think about what happens in the Odyssey, they're thinking about these particular like 4.5-ish books, because all of the actual adventures happen.
Yeah, they're all in flashbacks. It's so interesting.
Yeah. And it's Odysseus telling what happened to him, which introduces this like aspect of the unreliable narrator, you know, Mr. Nobody, king of unreliable narrators. But also provides an opportunity to think about orientation through narrative, like how Odysseus interacts, but also how his interactions are shaping the audience's expectations, because in many ways people have made compelling arguments about how the stories that Odysseus tells are meant to kind of model correct behavior to the Phaeacians so that they will do the right thing and let him go. Because he's aware when he's telling these stories that Aeacus, I think, is the name of the king. Embarrassing that I can never remember. I always want to call the king of the Phaeacians Aeolus, but that's the.
But I feel like it's not, because I was just reading some of the Odyssey, and Aeacus is somebody else. I know there's like lots of double up names. Now I'm
Alcinous. Alcinous is the king of the Phaeacians. I always have to. There's too many A's.
100%.
Aeacus is someone else. You're right. But yeah, so that he wants Alcinous, because Alcinous has kind of. There's sort of a sense, I think, that Alcinous wants Odysseus to marry his daughter Nausicaa and like stay and be absorbed into their people. And Odysseus doesn't want that to happen. So he's telling stories about his great escapes, you know, to sort of say, I don't want to stay here, which is kind of interesting in itself. And it means that as a scholar of the Odyssey in general, but of this section of the Odyssey, there's some interest in looking at the different ways that Odysseus deals with all the different encounters that he has and which ones sort of disarm him the most. And Circe is by far the most weird and dangerous in certain ways, because of all of the others, I am of the opinion that she is the one who comes the closest to actually taking Odysseus himself off track.
Mm-hmm.
He's like committed to getting home, and all of the other negative encounters he has and dangerous encounters, places where he loses his men, places where, you know, he's detained by a host, various things. He himself is never fully taken in by that, except with Circe, where he actually does forget about his Nostos, his homecoming, and his desire for that for a full year. And he has to be reminded by his men. It's the only time that happens.
Yeah, that's true.
So I ended up digging in a little bit and thinking about what it is about Circe that is so disorientating. What is it about her that drags him away from that, you know, wrenches him out of that pattern and that thing that he has been doing all along, this desire to return home to his, you know, his lawfully married wife and his legitimate son, you know, like it's this very like heteronormative, cis heteropatriarchal like mold that he's trying to get back into. And Circe almost manages to get him out of that. And in fact, like at both ends, he's only spared in the initial sort of volley with her because Hermes intervenes. Hermes comes down and says, hey, I'll help you. You're going to be in trouble. He knows there's a problem, but he has no way to fight her without help from the gods.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, when after their exchange, and he seems to come out on top, but then he forgets for a full year. So what is it about her that is so out there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I love Circe. I think she's really interesting. I wish we got more, you know, obviously it's, you know, it's Homer, so we don't really get what's going on in her head.
No, and she doesn't really like appear anywhere outside of Homer until you get later where they're just playing on her in Homer. But like, we don't really get like a sense of her. She's most interesting.
Yeah, and she gets, so the next, like, I think the next thing I can think of is her appearance in Apollonius, where she is quite defanged.
Right.
She shows up in the Argonautica, and she performs this ritual to clear the miasma from Jason and Medea for their murder of Medea's brother.
Mm-hmm.
But then she sort of turns them away. She agrees to do it, but then she turns them away because, you know, that's also her nephew that they killed. So she's like, you know, I'll do this because it's within my power and you're my niece. But then you have to go, essentially. So it's a much more defanged Circe than what we get in the Odyssey, where she is extremely scary. She's like very threatening because she just can't be stopped. And yeah, so one of the things that I kind of laid out in my thesis is that one of the reasons I think she's so scary is that there are these two. So when, as Odysseus travels through the story, there are these two kind of patterns that emerge, which a lot of scholars have picked up on and talked about. There's a lot of scholarship on the Odyssey, and sort of Homer in general is very like structuralist. You know, here are these dichotomies that emerge, and we're going to talk about things in contrast to each other, but they tend to be very binary, which is why I'm like want to stick my little queer theory fingers in there and be like, nice dichotomy you got there. What's outside of it? Like,
can I just say, you've given me now 2 possible titles for this episode, and because like earlier I wrote down that ringing a little queer bell, but now you just said like sticking your little queer fingers. It's like, I'm like, maybe that one's weirder, but I just want to say I really appreciate both options.
Both are good. Well, I'm sure I will continue to say such unhinged things.
You're gonna keep. I'm just gonna have to pick from so many.
Well, I wish you luck. Yeah, the nice thing about Classically Trained is we just get to use the title of the media. It's very easy.
See, I like to have some fun, but sometimes there's just too many wild things to use. Yeah. But it's a good like problem to have.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, like I love, and yeah, that's what's compelling to me about queer theory is like picking apart dichotomies and binaries that other people have identified and saying, okay, well, what's working about this? What's not working about this? And so I kind of built my own, I sort of built my own binary, which I'm like 4 months out from this thesis and I'm already like, I didn't need to do that. Or like I could have done it in a more sort of, this is a spectrum and Circe is still weird or like at the far end of it or even defies it entirely, but like there is a spectrum here, than the sort of dichotomy that I set up in the argument of the original paper. But like I did that in part to point out the way in which Circe tends to get identified either as like scary witch who's going to hurt you or kill you or whatever, or like exotic seductress who's gonna like make Odysseus stay forever with her sexy wiles, which are kind of, to be fair, in some ways the 2 types that we get in the journey books. Yeah. But in other ways, I was like, well, I think really what we're seeing is like the encounters that he has where he's dealing with people who are to a lesser or greater extent like host types, that they welcome Odysseus and his men, they feed them, they offer them conveyance on to their next place, they give them gifts, they sort of are at least semi-obedient to what's called xenia, the like guest friendship sort of tropes.
Yeah.
And then the encounters that are like the exact opposite of that, where they try to eat Odysseus and his men. And we have a bunch of kind of cannibals that are floating around. And Circe manages to be both of those things.
And good for her.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very interesting because like it means that she's not really, she doesn't fit in, and also she very actively manipulates the expectations of a host in order to entrap and kill and, in my opinion, eat the people who come to her island. This is the like conspiracy theory section of the paper, but I am like fully on board, even though I can't 100% defend this academically, with Circe also being a cannibal, or kind of a cannibal, because she's not really a human, but none of these guys are. They're all monsters, but it's also like,
because the idea would be that she eats them after she's turned them into pigs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then that's really interesting too, because it's like, what counts as cannibal? Like, does she decide like she's not one because she's like, well, no, I've made them pigs, so it's fine.
Yeah. And like, does she eat them? So there's kind of 2 things to that particular argument. One of them is that pigs in the Homeric world are meat animals. They are raised basically just for eating and for sacrificing, and when you sacrifice an animal, you then eat the meat. Some of it's offered as food to the gods, and some of it's consumed by humans. But like, that's what pigs are for, is for eating. So I think pigs is kind of an interesting choice in a certain way. Like, they have no other livestock purpose. And then the second thing is this sort of creeping horror of Circe's island, where it seems like it's plausible that all of the animals that they encounter on the island are transformed humans. There's like two reasons. One of them is that so there's similar language used of the lions and stuff, and that she has these like enchanted lions that fawn like dogs and are, sort of under her sway, that scare the men when they're approaching her house. And they're described in similar terms to the men themselves once they've been transformed. There's like language that's the same. And then the other thing, and there's a particular word that's used, the Greek word is peleron or paleron, and it means like monster in a very specifically like this is some kind of magical creature kind of sense of monster. And that word, interestingly, and here's the like galaxy brain moment, that word also gets you. I don't claim credit for this. There's like a paper that I cite in the thesis, which I can look up so you can put it in the show notes, by a guy named Russell. But that word paleron.
It's okay. I'm just gonna joke about I don't even have show notes. I just because I'm a lazy butt.
Somewhere.
I put out too many episodes, but if people are interested, we can get it for them.
I was gonna say I'm happy to tweet about it when the episode comes out. But that word paleron also gets used of the stag. There's a giant stag that Odysseus encounters in the forest when he's scouting the island, and he hunts that stag and kills it in language basically exactly the same as, it's very like Iliadic language, like describing two warriors meeting in combat, and he kills the stag and he and his men eat it.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I've heard the argument of the stag being possibly a person before, and I'm fascinated by it. And then you've got so much more going on in it. I'm so excited.
Yeah, and so there's this like the thing with the stag, and then there's the thing with the pigs, which, for the record, in Egbert Bacher's book, The Meaning of Meat, which is all about the Odyssey and food and feasting and eating in the Odyssey, great, really interesting book. He talks about this very briefly. There's like a half page where one of the things he brings up is that in sort of journals of journals of explorers talking about cannibalism in the sort of exploration age, sometimes human flesh gets referred to as long pig, quote unquote, because apparently human flesh is very similar in texture and even flavor to pork.
Well, I mean, and this is like deeply not scientific, it's just like existing in the world, but like, I mean, pigs are used as the closest to humans in like countless ways, right? Like in terms of intelligence, totally. And like everything about them, or maybe it's not, it is intelligence, probably not at human level, but like I know that pigs are weirdly similar to humans. So yeah, the choice of them in the Odyssey, like I'd never thought of it in that sense.
It jumps out in a certain way, and like maybe that's us putting sort of modern ideas about pigs back on the ancient text. Like I don't have very much to like corroborate this like pig flesh cannibalism thing in the ancient Greek context. Unfortunately, I wish there was more, but I still think it's like a compelling reading. And the thing that I'll add, the last thing, is that Odysseus refuses to eat until he's seen his men restored. So after he and Circe have their confrontation, they go to bed and like seal their pact with the, embrace of love, TM, or whatever. There's some euphemism. That's not what it is, but I'm just making shit up. In any case, they have sex, and then, Circe lays out a bath for him, and some of the sort of nymphs that live on the island, he gets brought a meal, and it's not specific what he's been brought. Some people just translate it as food. Some people translate it as meat. It's an unspecific food word. I think often taken to mean meat, but like hard to say.
Yeah.
But he very specifically turns down the meal and says to Circe, before I accept any more of your hospitality, I need to see that my men are okay.
Yeah.
Which is such a red flag.
Yeah. But I also think it's kind of funny because it's like, I mean, dude, if that was one of your men, like, it's too late anyway.
Oh yeah, too late anyway. But there's like the anxiety about eating another person.
Yeah.
Even if they're
rightly
already
so.
dead.
Yeah, well, the history of Greek mythology, like, it's not the first, you know?
For sure. And there's such an interesting thing with how cannibalism is such a like strong taboo going all the way back in time, all the way back to the Odyssey. And in fact, the sort of cultural discourse around cannibals as the quintessential savage can be traced back to in the Western world, can be traced back to the Odyssey in certain ways. That when you meet a truly savage foreigner, once you've sailed across the sea, and I'm like using savage with big air quotes here, of course, because like obviously these are perfectly normal indigenous people, some of whom may have practiced some form of anthropophagy, which is to say the eating of humans, and some of whom probably didn't and just got this slapped on them. But because it was like the ultimate form of uncivilization and therefore being ripe for like the civilizing force of colonialism.
Yeah.
It's so embedded. And it really comes back like you can see it in the Odyssey in a very similar way. It's a bit of an archetypical text for that exact discourse. The Odyssey is a great like text for post-colonial studies.
Oh, I bet. Okay, before I forget to ask this, because it's just occurring to me, but also like now I want to learn everything about Odyssey in that context. But do you know offhand, like I'm trying to think of the sourcing on, you know, before we started recording, I told you about how excited I am to study or read Seneca's Thyestes for similar reasons, because I think ancient mythological cannibalism is fascinating. But I'm wondering whether that curse on, you know, Agamemnon and Menelaus' family is Homeric in origin or whether it comes later. Do you know offhand?
I am not 100% sure. I don't know if it's Homeric in origin specifically. I could check, but I don't know offhand. Yeah, no, that said, I do think that the sort of mythos of like Tantalus, Pelops, that whole Atreus, that whole family line is cursed as fuck, and the cannibalism recurs because you get Tantalus and then you get Atreus, and I think that those stories do go back. Like we have evidence of them existing in the tradition before, like the sort of references that we get. Like I think that Cassandra makes a reference to the kind of curse on the House of Atreus in her dialogue in Aeschylus' Agamemnon.
Yeah. No, yeah, I know it's definitely at the very oldest, or at the youngest, it's Aeschylus. But I was curious whether it does appear in Homer, because that would kind of make that connection to the Odyssey and that idea of cannibalism. But yeah, no, I mean, it's very specific. Now I'm just going to probably look it up myself after, too, because it's fascinating.
Totally. Well, and we do have, so one of the things I brought up, and so one of the things that is kind of interesting, especially if you do accept the argument that Circe is kind of, at the very least, arguably a cannibalistic figure, is that in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, we have the injunction against divine, like gods eating food of any kind, like regular food. That's not a divine thing to do. So
I didn't
we
clock
don't
that.
see,
That's so interesting.
yeah. So we don't see Circe eat because she is divine. And so this is another one of these contradictions where she's kind of both things, that she is a goddess, and like witches in this period of Greek literature are divine or semi-divine figures. Circe, Helen, Medea, they're descended from gods quite closely, if not actually divine themselves, like Circe kind of seems to be, because she's the daughter of a Titan. But she's also vulnerable. Like, Odysseus nearly kills her. And it's not like she almost gets the better of him, but as soon as he turns, he turns back her trick and resists her sort of volley of secrecy, she's not able to resist him by physical force and seems to genuinely believe that he could kill her, so she's not immortal. And she's also given the epithet speaking with human voice several times. So, which that comes up in Madeline Miller's Circe, much is made of it. But she's got this kind of semi-mortal aspect to her, this mortal vulnerability to her, while also being divine, that is very complicated. And it's all these aspects of liminality and being sort of in both categories or between categories, mortal and divine, that she has all this power over animals and the sort of defiance of the firm boundary between human and animal, between, civilized and wild, that she has this very civilized house that's like out in the middle of the woods. Basically, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's on the very edge of the map. That she is, she's a consummate host, and she protects and preserves Odysseus and his men once she's been convinced not to turn them into pigs. But then she sends them to the underworld. So she has this connection to death and this knowledge of the dead also that is very like spooky. Yeah, she just like, she exists across categories. And I mentioned this earlier, that she's also able to sort of manipulate the expectations of those categories in order to get the better of Odysseus, that like, and of his men, that they arrive and they're treated like, with sort of quote unquote civilized hospitality, and then the food that they're offered is what transforms them or gives her the power to transform them. So there's that kind of duality there as well, that she's a host, but her hostship is what allows her to do harm. And then on the other hand, it's at the moment that she's the most threatening that she becomes kind of this object of desire, that at the peak of their confrontation, she says to Odysseus, like, okay, let's like go to bed together. And, so it's the moment of terror turns into a moment of desire, and that those things kind of go hand in hand, and that it's her like erotic sway over Odysseus that then causes him to forget about his like beautiful cis hetero marriage and all this stuff. That there's just like so much caught up in that, and that, I mean, that goes back to a sort of idea in Ahmed that I brought up in the thesis, that an object of desire doesn't create the desire, but desiring a particular object can, or a particular body can drag other things with it, other encoded meanings. And that in this case, by desiring such a kind of queer object, Odysseus is dragged off of the normative path. And so regardless of Circe's identity, like, we don't have access to her personal identity really, but she is in many ways defiant of norms and associated with things that are kind of scary and out there, transformation, death, you know. But even without that aspect of identity, she has a queering force on the narrative because of what she's able to do to Odysseus, do to her sort of, you know, the disorientating effect that she has, because she brings into his world things that he shouldn't be able to sort of be in contact with in this normal way, and brings out of reach things that he should have and desire, you know, like his return home. Yeah, there's a lot going on.
There's so much. And I mean, it's just all like, I could listen to this stuff forever. Hence, just like, I like to say a lot because it's also interesting. Also, I just have to say, what the listeners can't see, and also you probably can't either, but behind me there, I have this little replica. Well, it's not even a replica, but like a little Cantharos from Athens that has Circe turning men into pigs on it. And it's
that's a great
me.
That's actually, it's probably the same. I actually think I made a reference to maybe even that same Cantharos. There's a particular one.
It's very like, doesn't look ancient at all, but it's cute.
Yeah, totally. But that image, because there's a paper that I read for this as part of my research that sort of talks about that and other images of her, which of course that art is much later, like it's quite significantly post-Homeric. But there's an interesting emphasis in the imagination of Circe and what she does that depicts the men between states. And that's the horror, right? It's not just Circe and pigs, and it's not Circe and men threatening them. It's Circe and this amalgamation that defies anything normal or acceptable, because like animals are one thing and humans are another thing, and you can't be both. But she's the steward of the transformation, you know. And it's this really like intense thing, and it's a very violent thing too. There's a particular formula that gets used for her transforming them. It's rhabdopeplegia, striking with her wand. And that gets used twice of her. And the verb, which I think is plago or something like that, I could check. The verb that is used about 50 times in the Homeric lexicon, and it's pretty much always violence or force. So it's a very distinctly like, she is like hitting these guys. And that's another thing that removes her from the kind of host mold, because the hosts never offer violence. Even if they're kind of trying to detain Odysseus and his men, they're never violent towards him or his people. But Circe is. Yeah. She hits them. She strikes them physically. And like, there's a very, you know, distinctive thing. The only other time, and in fact, I like wrote a long footnote about this, and then I had to take it out of the final thesis because one of my advisors on the project was like, this is long enough and sort of important enough that you either need to work it into the text or you need to take it out. I was like, okay, fine. So I took it out, but it's like in my brain.
Well, that's what I'm here for.
Totally. And that the only other time somebody like rhabdopeplegia, somebody's striking with her wand, is actually Athena in book, I think 22 or something like that, where Athena has transformed Odysseus into this guise of an old man to disguise his identity from everybody on Ithaca. And the first time she transforms him, she comes down and she says to him, hey, I'm going to do this. Like, just so you know, I'm going to transform you. You will look different, whatever. And she like taps him, or like she like touches him with the wand, but it's a different verb. And it's definitely just a like pap. It's not a blow. The second time, Eumaeus, the swineherd, is like coming back suddenly, And Athena doesn't have time, or she doesn't take the time to come down and say to Odysseus, hey, just so you know, I'm going to do this now. And that time she strikes him. So I have, again, like a conspiracy theory thought that the thing that divides those two instances is the question of consent. The first time she's very clear to Odysseus, this is what's going to happen. Informed consent, TM.
Yeah, she like gives him the opportunity to say no.
Yeah, exactly. The second time, no such thing. It's a forcible transformation without knowledge or consent. And that is what Circe is inflicting, because that's the exact same language. It draws the mind back to, oh, right, like what Circe did, where she's forcibly transforming them. So I think there's like a real aspect of hitting to what Circe does, and which is quite interesting, and that, you know, I mean, also there's of course also all the, like, I don't know, Lacanian or Freudian or both stuff about the fact that she wields a wand, which is very phallic.
I don't know. But okay.
I also don't know, but on the one hand, I'm kind of like, does everything have to be about dicks?
Exactly.
Especially when we're talking about women.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's something very funny about thinking about Circe and Odysseus's confrontation before they go to bed together as a dick measuring contest, and Odysseus comes out on top.
I will agree with you that if I hear it that way, it's not so bad. But every time I hear Freudian shit like that, I'm just like, oh my god, dude, like we get it. I know,
it's like, do we really? Yeah,
and like we don't have to be.
It's like, I've had enough of you, Freud, and also Lacan. Phallocentrism is out.
Yeah, we're finished with it. And I just say, like, I'm really thrilled I brought up the silly little Kentharos I've had for like 5 years, because that was so interesting to think about it in that context of like I have this thing sitting behind me. It's literally there all the time. I'm in this office all the time recording, and it's never occurred to me how much, like, to describe it for the listeners, and like, even though this is like a silly little replica I bought at a tour shop, it is like the guy's head is a pig and the body is still very human, but I also think he's got a tail. Yeah, very tail,
something like that.
It's like it's very in the vein of Minotaur, which is quite interesting because, like, I like to think a lot about how the Minotaur is like singular in mythology. In like, I think in mythology itself, he's pretty singular in the way that, like, not only is there only one of him, you know, unlike, say, the centaurs or satyrs or all these other, like, half human, half animal hybrids, but he also is the only one that's, like, top half animal, and that makes him behave like an animal in a way that, like, yes, you can argue that the centaurs are violent as shit, but they still have, like, the cognitive ability of humans. They just, like, choose to wield violence, whereas the Minotaur has the cognitive ability of a bull and the body of a human, and that, like, the connection to that Circe's transformation with that, I don't know, just interests me. Like, the sort of ramifications of, like, that mid transformation, or what you said of, like, the actual force of being transformed, and how that's what the art depicts and stuff.
Totally. And I think that, like, there's also that aspect of hybridity remains with Circe's pigs, that when we get the description of them once they've been put out into the yard, that they're like weeping and crying because they still have their human minds, but they have no ability to express themselves or act on their sorrow. So there's still that element of very, and again, like, very troubling in the Greek mindset, hybridity, that they really don't go for boundary crossing, except in these exceptional cases where it's either a source of heroism or horror, and sometimes both. And that is also a very, like, that's like a very classic, that the sort of two things can go together, can also be a very classic sort of queer trope of, like, the combination of the desired thing and the terrifying thing. And I think Circe exhibits that a lot. It's really common in the Gothic, sort of Gothic tropes of, like, the queer is a figure of both desire and terror, because then you can have a sort of you can look at them and desire and like work through these taboos in a way that is still like scary, and so therefore it's fine. It's like quite common in gothic and horror tropes. It's quite interesting. So yeah, no, it's good stuff, and like I don't know, Circe is just so rich. Like there is so much going on. I didn't even get that much into in the paper. Like I think there's like a sort of whole other thing going on with her sending them to the underworld and then them coming back to her, that she's like the last way station between death and the real world, and they have to stop with her both ways. And that also like she is the one who gives Odysseus this advice about how to handle Scylla and Charybdis, that like he's just gonna have to run the gap and some of his men are going to die. And that's just the advice that she has, is like, sorry, you gotta kill your men if you ever want to get home.
Yeah.
Which is itself like kind of a terrible, like all of her advice is like, time to die, I guess.
Yeah.
But the fact that Odysseus like lives is almost beside the point.
I mean, yeah, that's because it's like I like that because you're so right, and then it also all like comes back around to like Odysseus just doesn't really care, like like he's just so willing to sacrifice his men like at any possible opportunity, and like he gives us this idea that he is affected by it, but it doesn't ever. It's like affecting in a very like impersonal way, because he's like, I'm affected because I'm a human, but like he would never let the tragedy of how many of his men die actually affect anything that he does, or like any decision
which
that
is
he
like
makes.
All of them, to be clear.
Exactly. By the end it's all of them. Yeah. But like it like as it's going, he's like, oh, I lost so many men, but he never once is like, so maybe I should behave differently going forward to avoid losing more. Like it's just sort of like it happens because they're just there, and the only point is to get him home. Like the other people are just kind of like, and actually, you know what, even just talking about this, the one time that he does make a real effort is with Circe.
Yeah, that they have a full funeral for the guy who falls off her roof and breaks his neck.
But even also the pigs, like him getting them turned back. Like I feel like there's very few other times, if any, where he actually makes an effort to save anyone going forward.
Yeah, that he's very like prepared for them to die.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because like one of the sort of arguments that I've heard and that I kind of agree with about the arc of the Odyssey is that it's a lot about Odysseus sort of clawing his way back to society and like participation in society, that when he first is setting out, he's still very much in like the Iliadic mindset that's extremely like, some of you may die. And which is like, great, thanks, like, you jerk. And he still wants to like demand hospitality from all of these strangers and ideally receive, like, get gifts from them, and if he has to steal them, okay. But that as he goes along, he's kind of more and more like, ooh, maybe this is bad. And I think that, but also that his men keep pissing him off, like on the island with the cattle of the sun, that he's like, you idiots, like, you fucked up.
I gave you one job.
Yeah, one job. And same with the bag of winds. So there's definitely like this tension, I think, where Odysseus kind of needs to get rid of all of his men, or he seems to like not care, in order to accomplish his homecoming. And as you said, and doesn't seem to care, but at the same time, it's like as he loses them, he seems to kind of come more and more to thinking about like, oh, maybe I should be like a little more careful. That like these guys are in fact helping me. And that like, and I mean, it's also to come back to like circle back to something I said earlier, that he's the one telling the story about how this all went down. So he's free to frame what happened in a way that puts him in the most heroic light, you know?
Yeah. Well, and like, it's Odysseus, so he's going to, and he's going to do it well.
Of course.
Right? Where it's like, that's his entire personality in both epics. It's that he is a man who can talk himself out of anything. And so it's especially interesting to think about it. Yeah, how much he could be lying about with that in mind.
Yeah, for sure. And it's it's great stuff. And yeah, that he then sort of tries all this out on Alcinous and the other Phaeacians, and that it does work too. That Alcinous is like, great, what a great story. Here, have like all this treasure and a boat, and you can sail home, you know?
Yeah. So
there's just like layers and layers with Odysseus, and the journey books are so interesting because of that like narrative thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they are also very interesting to think about through that sort of queer theoretical lens, and I thinking about like, whose story are we hearing and how coherent is it? Because with Odysseus as like the focal, like he's giving us the focal point, it's just very possible to like connect what he's going through with what is actually directly being said to us in the narrative, and how we can interpret those things, which is kind of fun. And I mean, obviously it's all like, you can decide, any scholar, any reader is going to decide how seriously they take, like, oh, is this happening because Odysseus in the story is doing something on purpose, or is it just sort of convention? Is it just what had to happen? Like, characterization in the Greek literary sphere, not so consistent usually. So you can like kind of take it with a grain of salt, but it's still, I don't know, I like to do the like deep dive and really take it seriously, because I think it's more fun that way.
Agree entirely. Okay, there's one thing that you mentioned a couple of times, but like I would love to know more of your thoughts on it, because it really stood out to me, and it's never really occurred to me. But like the Circe and Xenia aspect, it had never really occurred to me. And like Xenia is something I feel like I haven't mentioned it in a while on the show, but it's something that I've tried to like emphasize, you know, in the past, like this guest host relationship.
It's a big deal.
It's a really big deal, and like, you know, I mean, I think just that we brought up, you know, Tantalus and Atreus, like they are well, I guess maybe not Atreus quite as much, but like Tantalus is such a good example of the problem with breaking Xenia, where, you know, like, you're not supposed to feed your child to your guests. Like, that's a big no-no. And of course, like, the idea is not just the feeding your children. It is like breaking anything when it comes to this like sacred guest host relationship. And it had never really occurred to me how much Circe does not give a flying fuck, it seems like, about Xenia. But at the same time, like she purports to care. You know, the whole reason why she can change the men into pigs is because she feeds them or gives them something to drink. And that's really interesting, because that is inherently Xenia, which is why they trust her. And then she's like, wait, no, I don't care. Like, that's really interesting. And I mean, I don't even know if I'm asking a question, but like, I want to hear more about that. If there's more.
There totally is. So I'll say a couple of things. Xenia as a concept has been, like, a lot of ink has been spilled. The idea of Xenia in Homeric literature reflecting something historical that was going on is very distinctly an idea that was championed by Moses Finley, who, in like the 60s and 70s, who's a very influential scholar. And I think that's like a divisive opinion these days because we don't have a ton of other like evidence from the Homeric period to know whether the Homeric literature is reflecting a real social custom or if in some ways it's a function of the formulaic nature of the story. Because there is a distinctive Xenia pattern. Like that this is how hospitality type scenes go down. There's quite an interesting book by a guy named Reese, who breaks it down into like elements and compares different versions. And one of them that he talks about is Circe. And it's very clear that she follows a lot of the aspects, but also you can see where the certain divergences give color to the scene. So one of the earliest aspects of a Xenia scene in the Odyssey is the dog at the door motif that happens at the beginning of a number of these scenes. And like one of them is the golden dog statues that are but that the Phaeacians have set up that are at the door of Alcinous's court, and they give this like sense of majesty and wealth and power. And one of them is Argos, the loyal guard dog who sees Odysseus and then immediately dies. That's sort of idea of like the passing of the watch, maybe like that kind of thing. Or like that the wait is over. There's that kind of intense thematic thing. And then with Circe, that the dog at the door is these enchanted beasts. And there's this like spooky, like wild thing that is going on that's reflected in this particular version of this element of a type scene. And that she then also, she feeds her guests, she provides a seat, she provides a meal, she provides a bath and a bed. She does all of these things. There are a couple other divergences, like Odysseus is brought into the house to her bed rather than being given a bed sort of in the anteroom, which is the typical version. I believe she bathes him herself, which is also a bit of a divergence. So there's these kind of particular, like, where Odysseus is being drawn into her household, into her like web of, I'm making a hand gesture that is not going to translate, but she's reeling him in using these tools of hospitality in this very real way. So it's like, she knows it. She knows social behavior and is not shy about using it to get what she wants. And like very actively perverting what hospitality should be. Like another aspect is the giving of Pompeii conveyance onto the next place. And the conveyance that she provides is go to the underworld. Like that's the gift that she gives them, is death in a very real way, which is also it's this kind of subversive thing that she does. And it's not the only time that we see the kind of tools of hospitality used to make something work. And this is like a thing so Helen does something that is comparable, I think, when she uses her pharmaca, her magical drugs, in the wine, when Telemachus is at Sparta, to make the men stop crying about all of their grief from the war and go to sleep. And she like manipulates their emotions using this sort of tool of hospitality, but it's essentially an intensification of what wine already does. And she's not changing them, whereas Circe's pharmaca physically alters the men who consume her food and drink her wine. Also, that somebody, I can't remember who pointed this out, something that I read points out that she, what she feeds them is food that is typically given as like grave offerings, like particular types of grain is what she like gives to the pigs, I think. So there's this thing where like everything that she does is like technically correct according to Xenia, but for like from bad intentions or done wrong in this just slightly off way that is so enticing.
And there's no, you know, she doesn't get any kind of punishment for it in a way that like anyone else who breaks Xenia would mythologically. Like,
no.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, it's just like fine. And then at the end, she turns around and she does send Odysseus off. Like, for better or for worse, yeah, she tells him, okay, you have to go and like, here's, you know, these are the hazards that are ahead of you. But she gives him this incredibly useful advice. Like, yeah, okay, a bunch of his men die when they go past Scylla, but if not for her advice, either they wouldn't have even known about it and it would have died anyways, or they might have sailed into the whirlpool. And then also the whole thing with the sirens. She tells him how not to get caught by the sirens. So she gives him some of the most useful advice that anybody gives him. And she does send him off. When he expresses to her, hey, I want to go, like he's been under her spell for a year, but she doesn't stop him once he gets his mind back enough to say, I'm ready to leave. Which is, again, like it's another reversal. She doesn't stay in any role the way that, you know, people would maybe want. And I think that's one of the reasons that scholarship is kind of divided on her, or why because she gets brought up in any argument, structural analysis, anything about like the structure of the Odyssey, how these episodes work. She always is a center point to some extent, which makes sense. She kind of comes in the middle of it all. But she also, like, her behavior can be framed in such a way as to support basically any argument because she's doing it all. Which I think in and of itself is like, okay, so maybe instead of fitting her into this category or that category, we should be talking more about how uncategorizable she really is as a figure, because she is so out there, and it's really awesome stuff. Like, I love Circe. She's so great.
I mean, I've always loved her because she is fascinating. I mean, I also just think like she's one of very few women characters in Greek myth that are seemingly totally empowered. Like, she has agency in a way that is incredibly rare, and so it's just so easy to fucking love her. But I also like, so I've always been really interested in her as like a contrast to Calypso too, which everything you're saying is just like emphasizing that so completely, because like I think it's so fascinating because like Calypso, I mean, we don't get a lot about her, but she presents this idea of like she's a hot nymph who presumably, like, based on Odysseus's character, he was probably really into it at the beginning, and then she locks him down and like doesn't let him leave. And it's like a full 9 years or something that he's with her, right? Like, it's most of the time.
It's like a
Maybe
really long
7.
time.
Yeah, it's absurd. And like it, you know, so she has like all of everything about her suggests that she should be the one that he enjoys kind of spending time with, I guess, like comparatively to Circe, who's like, you know, she's changing his men into pigs, she's threatening him, like all these different things that seem to make her a figure who should be like more dangerous, or more like he should be more wary of her, I guess. But then, like you're saying, like, she lets him leave. She just lets him go because she, you know, I don't know, she just serves this totally different role to Calypso, but at the same time, like, seems to be the one who would be more likely to do what Calypso did, you know, right? And vice versa. Like,
totally.
Calypso would be chill. I don't know. It's,
it's also like there's this complicated thing where like we don't know, like I slotted Calypso in this sort of argument that I was making kind of more with the host types to be like, yeah, like she detains Odysseus with excessive hospitality. Like she just keeps keeping him and, you know, keeps him in her house and so on. but we don't see his arrival on Ogygia, her island.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know what kind of reception she gave him, and he returned. Like, we really have no idea. All we know is we don't see Odysseus and Calypso until after he's become miserable.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like so hard to gauge because, yeah, like it's so interesting because it seems like the two of them are almost mirrors of each other, that with Circe, he starts aggressive, hostile, and becomes comfortable and feels safe. And with Calypso, probably the other way around, but we don't know. I mean, maybe he washed up on her beach and she was like, great, mine now. And he was never into it. Like, it's very hard to gauge. And that, like, I mean, I have like a whole, actually, Odysseus is a pretty good husband thesis living in my head rent free from when I was an undergrad about how he's like shockingly faithful to his wife and, you know, treats her like a human being. And, you know, the two of them, like, he sleeps with other women, but not we never see him willingly climb into bed with, like, Circe is kind of the exception of that, but even that is transactional. It's like, they're making a peace agreement. They're going to go to bed together to seal that agreement.
Yeah.
But we don't know what the situation is with Calypso. He's clearly miserable while he's there. And Circe has a spell on him by the end. Like, he has been twisted out of his mind by being on her island by the end. So there's this, like, complicated thing there that, you know, he comes across as an adulterer, but I don't know, is he?
See, thank you. I support this. It is what all of the facial expressions I was doing earlier was. I was like, I feel like I have gotten a lot of shit for loving Odysseus, because he is my favorite.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I still think he's a snake, but
oh, for sure, like he's a piece of shit. But like, I think he's a lovable piece of shit, and I do think I have always also appreciated the Penelope relationship. Like, I think that in terms of what we have visibly seen in relationships in mythology, they are arguably healthier than, I mean, I won't say everyone, but like, there's not a lot of healthy relationships in myth for us to base anything off of.
I mean, say what you want. The man loves his wife.
Yeah.
Like, that's very hard. That's like the one thing about Odysseus's character that's very hard to argue with, is he very clearly loves his wife and wants to be with her. That is the whole thing. That's the whole thing all the way along, is he wants to be with her.
And you know what? I think a lot of people make a lot of arguments about that when it comes to, like, being faithful, because I don't know if there's evidence, or it's just presumably, like, you know, during the 10 years of the Iliad, because they have a lot of enslaved women, like, probably he was doing things there. And, like, and then you have Circe and Calypso or whatever. But, like, I mean, I also think a lot of even just, like, our thought processes on that kind of thing are entirely Christianized at this point, where it's like, you know, like, we don't know that was necessary. Like, that we don't know that Penelope was home being like, Odysseus is 100% faithful to me, and that's why he's a good husband. Like, we don't know that was the mentality, or whether the mentality was that like, dude's away for a 10-year war. He's doing shit, you know, like.
Yeah, and I mean, that's like, I don't think that any woman really expected that her husband was going to be 100% faithful to her. It was a huge double standard in Greek society, but like,
for sure.
all of these guys were having sex with women that weren't their wives, and also men. Like, that's just,
that was certainly common. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so to say that he's a bad husband because he has sex with other women is like a little bit of it's a very modern perspective on the issue. I will say this, I saw, this is like a complete sidetrack, but I saw a screenshot of like an old Tumblr post that was like, the first one reads straight character of the day, nobody, and the second one reads, hey, I disagree, Odysseus is plainly bisexual. And I was like, I think Odysseus is like the least bisexual Greek hero. The Venn diagram of Greek heroes who both don't have a weird situationship with another man and also actively demonstrate interest in women is very small. In the middle. He is the straightest Greek hero.
Yes. Yeah. I'm just like, literally my brain's just flying through different people. And also, yes, 100%. Yeah.
Right? Like basically all of them either have no demonstrated interest in women, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but like because, you know, being into women is cringe in misogynist Greek society.
Me reading the symposium.
Or,
what?
Yeah. Or have some kind of weird situationship going on with another guy. Like Achilles and Patroclus being the obvious ones, but like Orestes has some shit going on. Telemachus has some shit going on. Like Greater Ajax and Teucer, clearly there's some like stuff there. Like a lot of them have like a male buddy.
Well, and if you go beyond Homeric too, it still applies. Like Heracles,
totally. Well, and
even Theseus has Pirithous. Like,
Theseus. Yeah, Theseus. Yeah. I guess Jason also is fairly straight, but that's fine.
Yeah.
The straights can have Jason.
For sure. Yeah, that one just is like, yeah. But it's like, to me, my immediate thought on that being Jason is like, it's because Jason is the most boring, useless person in the world. So like, of course he's a straight man.
Yeah, he's like a shitty straight man. Odysseus is at least an interesting straight man.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, there are straight men who are just seem to be straight by default, and then there are straight men who are straight because they love women.
Yeah. Odysseus is interesting. He's got nuance and to his straightness, whereas Jason is like straight in the most, I am boring and I have nothing going on at all in my head type of straight.
Yeah. Which is why, to circle back to the original point, it is so interesting that Odysseus gets dragged away from that desire for his wife and towards like wanting Circe and wanting to be part of Circe's like weird, like gender fucked, like human animal fucked society on her island. Yeah. That he ends up kind of integrating there in a way that he doesn't anywhere else. He never forgets about Penelope except for while he's there. And he just like ends up soaked into Circe's like big queer bubble where everything is topsy-turvy. She's a female, like she's a woman and she's this female head of household. Also weird for the record. Single women do not act as primary hosts.
Yeah. And there's no men on her island.
No, as far as we know. And I mean, her nymphs are like, there's some nymphs around, but they're very anonymous. And so even that, she's like very outside of society of any kind, physically as well as like conventionally removed from normative society. And like she just creates this kind of queer society on her island that the people who arrive there can't help but become involved in. And it happens to Odysseus and his men immediately. As soon as they kill that stag, like they're kind of in. And she lets them go, but only only once Odysseus realizes what's happened, you know. He gets dragged out of his regular orientation, to use Ahmet's word, and onto this other line, or into contact with these things that regular patterns of belief, these sedimented ways of being, would have you never come into real contact with, always be sort of existing only in the imaginary. But on Circe's island, anything's possible.
Maybe that's the title. Stuff. God damn it.
I'm sorry, I'm making your life really hard.
It's too many good options. I'm writing that one down.
I love her. She's so great.
She really is. Like, she's just fascinating. I actually just spoke with an author who's written a novel, and it's about Circe after Odysseus, and like very fictionalized past that point, but introducing like a humanized version of Scylla and Glaucus and like some things within that kind of like realm. And it was just interesting. I was speaking to her about Circe, and she's like Greek but moved to the States when she was really young, and it was like this really an interesting kind of like mindset as well. Of course, I'm going to forget her last name, but it was Sophia, and it will come out soon. And the book is called An Unexpected Ally for my listeners. But yeah, it was interesting having that was like just like last week. And so I'm like, okay, I'm thinking about Circe in all these different kind of ways, having you on, and then having spoken to her. And it's just like, yeah, I don't know. I could talk about Circe honestly for like ever, because she is so interesting, and she's so unique in the mythology in so many ways.
Yeah. And I think in a certain way, like, it's almost demonstrated how interesting and scary she is in the Homeric version, that her later versions are so flattened and so defanged. I heard a really great paper about this at a conference, talking about how you can really see the like development of the way that later male authors are processing their discomfort with her by making her not threatening or turning her into, a caricature of the seductress or whatever, because they don't know how to deal with her. Her Homeric incarnation is too complicated, and we never see her like this again, really, because there's just so much. And yeah, I mean, if that's not queer, I don't know what is. That nobody can deal with her.
Yeah. Oh, well, this is absolutely fucking fascinating. I love it so much. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been so interesting. I fucking love Circe.
Thank you for thank you for having me on. I mean, I'm happy to talk about Circe at great length, and also like queer approaches to Homer, because I mean, it's just like I mentioned this earlier, so much Homeric scholarship is very structuralist in certain ways, like thinking about like things men do versus things women do and comparing the two and this and that. And that makes it so fruitful for queer analysis, because like that's where queer theory is the strongest, is where a dichotomy has been constructed, because queer theory is all about pointing out how unnatural those things are. And like, Circe is in that way very quintessentially queer, because she by paying attention to her role in the text, it really points out how unnatural, or how sort of constructed through repetition, the patterns that we detect in the text are, because she violates them. And so they just jump out all the more when we're looking at her, which is so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, every time I hear anyone who's got something to do with queer theory in the ancient world, I'm like, okay, please, come tell me about it. Because like, it's just, it's different. Like I want to hear these like these ways of looking at this stuff that is just vastly different than what we've been used to, or what has been, constructed, like you're saying, through these things where it's just like, you're just putting this onto the text. It's not there. For this like dichotomy. Like we can just break it all apart and look at what's actually going on and all the weirdness around her. And
and like, even where the dichotomies are present in the text, like, what does that tell us about how this culture that we study is constructing things, and how are we reading them, like I think it's a very fruitful, I mean, obviously I'm biased because this is what I'm like hanging my scholarly hat on, but I genuinely do think there's a lot of work to be done, and that like queer theory has a lot to offer to classics, but also that classics has a lot to offer back to queer theory in terms of thinking about how we study cultures and constructions within cultures, and how we process other cultures, because they've been gone for so long that like all we have in a way is our own perspective. And that can be really, really fruitful as well, which I mean is why I make a reception podcast. But
Which leads me to what I was just going to say next is, do you want to tell the listeners about your podcast?
Yeah, for sure.
Old news at this point, but let's remind everybody about Classically Trained.
Yes, of course. Not that I have put out an episode in a while because I was in fact in Europe all summer, but
poor you.
Yeah. First I was dying writing the thesis that I just spent an hour and a half telling you about, and then I was in Europe. So we haven't had an episode in a while, but we do have some coming out. Myself and Allison Marlin are the co-hosts of a podcast called Classically Trained, where we talk about modern media that depicts the ancient Mediterranean world, history, myth, and we talk about books, movies, games, hopefully eventually, and music, comics, all kinds of stuff. We range pretty widely. Our next couple of episodes, the ones that are recorded but not yet released, are The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner, which is like it's a great book. I recommend. And also, I think our Prince of Egypt episode is also coming up soon. Because I know we recorded it, but I don't think it's out yet. It's not out yet. So, I'm like forgetting. It's been a long time since we recorded, so I'm forgetting what we recorded. Yeah. But we have a lot of fun. So if you're interested in listening to me, a Homer scholar, and my partner, a late antique archaeologist, talk about various media and the way that it deals with these stories that Liv so kindly shares with you, then yeah, come check us out. Classically Trained. We are everywhere podcasts are found.
You guys do a lot that I explicitly don't, so I think it's such a great like accompanying podcast too, because like people often want me to talk about media and stuff, and like unless I have a guest, because that's the thing about doing 2-person podcasts, like you can talk about that kind of stuff, but like when it's just me, I'm like, that'd be weird because it's just like me listing things if it's not a discussion. So I'm like, this is great. Yeah. So there are other podcasts for that. Go find them. So yes, Classically Trained is a perfect option.
Yes, we do media. We've done a few of the like big hits of classical media, like we did Troy 2004, but we haven't done 300.
Oh, so. Well, I have. You don't know. I mean, have fun. But
yeah.
But you've done Percy Jackson, right? Because my listeners are always asking about Percy Jackson.
Yes, we did. In fact, we did a full like 5-parter. We did each book of the first series individually. And for anybody who, I will say, we are not afraid to be critical, but we do both love Percy Jackson. So, even though I like to believe that we're critical readers and watchers and listeners of all of the things, even the ones we really like. Those episodes were really a joy to do. So hopefully they are also enjoyable to listen to.
I bet. I'm sure. I was slightly before the Percy Jackson generation, and it perpetually frustrates my listeners, and I don't blame them, but I was like 18 when the first one came out. So just like, it didn't happen for me, but there are other people.
I mean, I didn't read them until I was a bit older, but I was still, they were in the air when I was growing up. So yeah. And like I'm really looking forward to the live action series dropping so that we can talk about that and think about, particularly so that we can kind of have a conversation about like race blind casting and race and antiquity and stuff like that in light of that, because also there's some like, one of the conversations that we had about Percy Jackson was like, Rick Riordan, please stop saying Western civilization challenge.
Oh, interesting.
It's like very mid-2000s, like layman parlance, and it really makes sense, but it's also like, oh, this is a problem. We need to talk about it. Yeah. So I look forward to revisiting that when the show comes out. And also just in general, getting to put out some new episodes and hopefully, get some stuff going. But so wonderful. The podcast is on Twitter. I am on Twitter at Julia M Perroni _M_Perroni, and I'm also on Blue Sky now.
Me too. I guess I should say that on the podcast. I haven't once. Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, there you go. Me and Liv, both on Blue Sky.
What's your handle on Blue Sky? Sorry, I interrupted by realizing
I'm at Julia M. Perroni without the underscores
Right.
on Blue Sky. So yeah, I can be found pretty easily there, and I'm attempting to migrate because
Yeah, me too.
not least because every time I see the phrase X, formerly known as Twitter, I take 2d8 of psychic damage.
Oh, yes. It's like at this point, it's just like you've just made it the most annoying app. Like, because it's just like a constant reminder of how stupid that man is.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Killer.
Billionaires are
killer.
inherently immoral and they should not exist.
You are so right.
Yeah.
Preach.
Right? God. In any case, thank you again so much for doing this. This was so much fun.
Thank you for having me, Liv. This was so fun.
Always.
I'm, always a joy to talk with you about this stuff and also about everything.
I mean, agree. I was just glad I saw the tweet and was like, hi, you're coming on my show. We're going to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, happy to.
Nerds, as always, thank you so much for listening, for joining along on these fun, weird little journeys into the depths of the ancient sources. Like, I am perpetually thrilled by the type of niche topics that I get presented for the show, for guests on the show. Like, it is always so interesting and specific and opens up all of these new and fascinating avenues to think about these characters or the text or God, everything. Oh my God, it's just, what a joy. As I said, though, it is a bit of a, it was recorded a while back. You can also tell by the reference to the Percy Jackson show still to come. Obviously it exists now. I won't pretend that I know exactly how much of it exists, but it does. And I know that Classically Trained is back with at least one episode since we recorded this. You can go listen to that. And I mean, just bask in the queer theory reading of Circe and how she just doesn't fit into anything. And oh my gods, doesn't that just make her so much more interesting than she already was? I could listen to this stuff forever. Thank you all so much for listening, as always. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, my assistant producer. Laura Smith is the production assistant and audio engineer. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcasts network. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Find me on Patreon. That's what I say at the end here, right? On Patreon, you can get access to bonus episodes and more, and just support the show because I give you 2 free episodes a week. So let's be honest, my Patreon does not have much bonus content because the free stuff is enough. So if you want to help me with the free stuff, show your love and support, consider that consider that to be what Patreon is. This is me explaining how incapable I've been of providing bonus content. But honestly, I've also had that Patreon for 7 years. So there's a lot of stuff that's on there. So take a listen. Patreon.com/mythsbaby. I will stop trying to remember my script without it in front of me. I am Liv, and oh my God, I love this shit. I also just recorded an episode that'll be coming out next month about Homeric shit, and now I just want to live in the Homeric world, like forever and always, and